The first scream cut through the trees just after sunset. It sounded far away at first, thin and frayed, like someone was being dragged across gravel while trying to cry for help. It stopped almost as soon as it began, leaving only the wind and the soft crackle of the campfire. For a moment, there was the comfortable illusion that it had been nothing, an animal, a branch, some trick of distance. Then it came again, closer. The old campsite sat in a forest that had been reopened to the public after a decade of being fenced off. No one ever really explained why it had been closed. People said it was because of wildfires, or logging disputes, or some vague government project. The truth was wrapped in rumor and half-remembered headlines. The only thing that mattered now was that the dirt lot had space for parked cars and the trailhead was clear enough to follow. By the time the campfire was burning strong and the first drink was poured, the forest had settled into its nighttime rhythm. Insects chirped. The trees creaked softly. Somewhere far off, water moved over rocks. For a while, it felt like every other camping trip. Jokes, stories, the glow of phones held up for light, the smell of cheap liquor and burnt hot dogs. The third scream cut everything in half. It was close now, so close it seemed to rip the dark open. It was wrong in a way that defied easy description. Too loud, too long, and full of a kind of pain that didn't sound survivable. It rose and fell without any rhythm, a jagged, hysterical wail that made the air vibrate and the dirt shiver underfoot. Then it stopped. Silence fell so heavy it felt physical, pressing against eardrums, flattening every other sound. Even the fire seemed to burn more quietly, its crackling swallowed as if the night had grown a thick skin. No one moved. No one spoke. Breathing felt like too much noise. The instinct to help the one drilled into people. By years of media and morality and emergency hotlines fought with something older and colder. The older thing won. It whispered that no human throat could hold a scream like that for long. That voices broke. People passed out. Bodies gave up. This one did not. The fourth scream came just as legs were beginning to relax, just as shoulders started to unclench. It burst through the trees, even closer now, as if the distance between the campsite and its source had been cut in half. It carried the same impossible endurance, the same bottomless agony. But there was something else threaded through it this time. Recognition. Not recognition of the sound, but the sense that the scream itself had recognized the listeners, like it had found them. The fire was the only thing keeping the darkness at bay, a soft orange circle in a sea of black. Beyond it, the trees were nothing but dense walls of shadow. Every path between trunks looked like a doorway into a place the light would never reach. The air seemed to press them inward, closer to the flames, closer to each other. The fifth scream never came. Instead, the absence of it grew. The silence stretched and thickened until even the snap of burning wood felt intrusive. Time went strange. Seconds dragged and snapped like old elastic. The world seemed to tilt around the small ring of firelight, the forest leaning in, waiting. Finally, someone muttered that it had to be a prank. Someone else muttered that it had to be an animal. Their own voices sounded wrong in the air, like sound effects layered over a movie rather than words spoken by real mouths. Then, from the darkness beyond the fire, there was a soft, measured sound. Footsteps they approached without hurry, moving across dead leaves and soil without crunch or drag, bare or padded or something else altogether. They came straight toward the fire, veering around trunks with the casual precision of someone who already knew the layout of the forest. Something emerged at the very edge of the light. It did not step fully into view. The flames licked against its outline and slid away, unable to catch a clear shape. It stood just beyond comprehension, more suggestion than form a darker patch in the dark. Tall enough to be person-like, but wrong in small ways that refused to resolve, there was the impression of shoulders. The hint of a head tilted slightly to one side. The gleam of something that could have been eyes, or could have been reflected firelight on wet bark. When it spoke, the voice was steady and quiet, yet it carried as if the forest itself was leaning closer to help. "There's a cabin," it said. not far. Someone is hurt. No one wanted to move. No one wanted to speak. The silence between each word stretched so wide it felt like a trap. They'd been screaming, the voice went on, almost conversational, as if repeating a mundane fact like the time or the weather. You heard it? No one agreed. No one denied it. The fire crackled, then seemed to reconsider and die down a fraction. They can't stop, the shape continued. They would if they could. They can't. They need someone to make it stop. The suggestion hung there, thick and suffocating. Make it stop. Not save. Not rescue. Just stop. Finally, someone asked the only question that could cut through that heaviness. How far? An hour, the voice said. Maybe less. I can lead you. You can help. The forest seemed to lean closer around that word help, twisting it into something else. The decision didn't happen all at once. It arrived in small, shameful pieces. The idea that it really was a prank. The idea that if it wasn't, then no one could live through that kind of suffering anyway. The conviction that going into the trees at night toward a sound like that was not bravery, but suicide. In the end, the group did what people usually do. They stayed. Someone said they'd look in the morning. Someone suggested calling for help instead. A phone flashlight flicked on, then off again, its thin beam suddenly inadequate. The fire was fed a few more pieces of wood, the gesture weak and apologetic. The shape at the edge of the light didn't move. The suggestion of its head tilted a little more. You won't go, it said, not a question. You heard them, and you won't go. No one answered. You listened to stories, the voice continued, soft and almost amused. You play at fear where it's safe. You swallow horror in neat little pieces and feel brave when the lights come back on. But not this. Not when something actually needs you. Someone tried to laugh, a tiny, brittle sound that broke apart before it could fully form. If you won't come, the shape said, you should at least understand what you're refusing. The next scream started without warning, erupting from the trees so violently that the fire flared and bent away as if pushed by a physical blast. It was closer than ever, now impossibly close, inside the ring of trees, inside the space between hearts and ribs. It throbbed with fresh terror, layered over with despair so deep it felt like drowning in sound. This time, there was something else under it. A jagged rhythm. Wet impacts. The unmistakable suggestion of someone working on flesh. The scream rose and did not break. Someone doubled over and gagged. Someone clamped hands over ears and discovered it made no difference at all. The sound wasn't traveling through air anymore. It was somewhere deeper, reverberating in bone and teeth and the soft places behind the eyes. It went on for minutes. Then longer, no one spoke. No one moved. Somewhere in the back of every mind was the same shameful thought, that maybe if they had gone when they had the chance, it would have been shorter. That maybe every second now was their fault. When it finally ended, it stopped in the same instant, cut off like a wire severed with a clean, final snap. The silence that followed felt worse than the scream. The shape at the edge of the light shifted. For the first time, it stepped forward just enough for details to slip into focus. Hands, maybe. Skin, maybe. Something that had once been a face, but had spent too much time in places that didn't care about human shapes. It was smiling. The smile didn't reach where its eyes should have been. You'll remember this, it said. Every time you pretend to be scared for fun, every time you tell yourselves you do the right thing, you'll remember what you did tonight. It paused, listening to the way the silence answered. But that's not enough, is it? Stories need more than guilt. They need consequences. The fire lurched in its pit, flames twisting into unnatural angles, bending toward the figure instead of up into the air. Shadows lengthened and thinned, stretching across the ground like spilled ink, reaching for boots and hands and faces. The ring of light shrank, not as if it were fading, but as if something outside it was swallowing it. Inch by inch. Here is what happens now, the voice said calmly. They will keep screaming. Not here. Not where you can reach them. But they will scream. Every night. Somewhere you cannot go. The trees creaked. Bark split in long, narrow fissures that breathed cold air. The darkness between trunks took on depth, not like distance, but like an open mouth. You will hear them, it went on. Not every night. Not predictably. Some night, when you're alone, or half asleep, or walking home in the dark, you will hear that scream again. Exactly the same. Exactly as close. And you will know there is nothing you can do. You had your chance. The ring of firelight was a tight circle now, barely large enough to sit in without touching knee to knee. The air inside it felt thin and stale, like it had been breathed too many times. You will tell yourselves it's a memory, the shape said almost kindly. You will tell yourselves it's all in your head, and maybe you'll even believe it sometimes. But your body will remember. Your bones will remember. The parts of you that heard it the first time will know it's still happening. The shape leaned closer. For a heartbeat, the face came into full view. It was wrong. Not grotesque in any cartoonish way, but arranged in ways that made no sense. Features slightly shifted from where they should have been, proportions just off enough to make the brain slip on them like oil. Looking at it for more than a second felt like pushing your hand into boiling water on purpose. Eventually, it whispered, "You'll want it to end more than they do." As the fire collapsed inward on itself, not burning out, but folding. Its light warping and spiraling downward into a point no bigger than a pinhead before vanishing completely. The campsite was plunged into complete black, a black with weight and thickness, and a faint, suffocating smell of burned hair. No one spoke. No one screamed. For several endless seconds, there was nothing but the sound of blood and ears and hearts stumbling over themselves. Then, somewhere far off in the trees, the scream started again. It was faint, almost delicate, as if it had been moved a great distance away. It wove through the forest, thready and high, not as unbearable as before, but somehow worse for its distance. It went on, never rising or falling, never breaking. Like a sound that had forgotten how to end. In the darkness where the fire had been, hands fumbled for lighters and matches and phone screens. Flames tried to catch, then sputtered out. Batteries flickered, then died. The air pushed back against every attempt at light with a patient, unhurried pressure. The night did not want to be seen. Eventually, the group gave up on relighting anything. There was nothing to do but wait for dawn. The hours crawled by, stretching out into a sleepless eternity. The scream continued somewhere out in the black, drifting in and out of hearing, fading to nothing before returning a little closer, then a little farther away again, like something circling. When the first pale hint of morning finally seeped through the branches, it didn't feel like salvation. It felt like a reprieve that had not been earned. The campsite looked exactly as it had the day before. The fire pit cold and gray. The tent sagging slightly with dew, stray bottle caps half pressed into the dirt. The forest was just trees again. Birds called to each other with ordinary, cheerful stupidity. The sky was clean and blue. If there had been footprints at the edge of the campsite, it had been erased by the night. The scream was gone. Rationality arrived with the daylight, as it always does. Explanations unfolded. Shared hallucination. Animal distress. Stress, exhaustion, some collective psychological event. The story began to rewrite itself in palatable terms, sanded down at the edges, smoothed into something that could be swallowed without choking. But none of those explanations changed what happened afterward. The first night back home, one of them woke up with tears on their face and the echo of a familiar sound lodged in their throat. There had been no dream they could remember. Only the fading aftertaste of an endless scream and the memory of a small, dark shape just out of sight. Another woke to the faintest hint of it while washing dishes. The noise slipping between the clink of plates and the rush of water. It was gone before it could be fully heard, leaving behind a tremor in the hands and a sudden, irrational hatred of silence. Days passed, weeks. For a while, nothing happened. The forest trip became easier to talk about. A weird night. A story to tell with nervous laughter, heavy on the parts that made it sound like a prank, and light on the parts that made sleep difficult. Then the screams came back. Always alone. Always in the dark. Sometimes inside the skull. Sometimes in the distance. Sometimes close enough that it vibrated the air in a small, specific pocket of space just inches from an ear. Never long enough to confirm. Never short enough to dismiss. They came while opening a fridge door late at night, while waiting for a train in an empty station, while standing in a bathroom with the shower running, steam fogging the mirror. There was never an obvious source. No one else ever heard them. There were other changes too, quiet at first. Sometimes, in the periphery of vision, there was the sense of something standing just at the edge of light, in doorways, at the far end of hallways, reflected faintly in windows as the outside grew dark. Look at it directly, and there was nothing there. Look away, and the impression of a head tilted slightly to one side remained. Sleep came in shallow, restless bursts. Waking hours blurred at the edges, thin and brittle. Sounds in apartments or houses' pipes, neighbors, creaking, would begin to reorganize themselves into patterns, into rhythms, into the distant suggestion of someone working patiently on something that wouldn't stop screaming. The worst part wasn't the fear, it was the understanding. Each time the scream came, it carried the same cracked, pleading tone. Underneath the raw agony lay a shape, a contour that could not be misheard, the shape of a wordless question. A demand? A desperate, unrelenting why. Why didn't you come? There was no answer that didn't sound like an excuse. There was no way to explain that stories are safer when they happen to other people, in other places, inside screens and speakers and printed pages. That real horror is messy and dangerous and always, always someone else's problem. The nights stretched. The screams continued. No one went back to the forest. No one reported anything to anyone who could help. Because there was nothing to report that wouldn't sound like madness, eventually, a new thought arrived, quiet and poisonous. Maybe it wasn't someone else anymore. Maybe, somewhere in the dark between trees and a cabin no one had ever seen, something had learned their shapes, learned their voices, learned their fear. Maybe the scream needed a new source. Throats broke. Bodies wore out. Even the strongest voices had to give out eventually. The next time the scream came, it sounded slightly different, not weaker, not stronger, more familiar. There is a kind of horror that lives in blood and bone, that cannot be turned off when the story ends or the narration stops. It paces behind the eyes, waiting for quiet moments. It grows in the spaces where action should have been taken but wasn't. It feeds on the knowledge that some doors were left closed on purpose. In time, the forest will reclaim the campsite. The fire pit will fill with leaves. The trail markers will rot. The cabin, if it exists at all, will lean and twist and sink into the ground. Becoming another shadow among many, the scream will go on. Carried by nothing, tethered to no throat anyone can find. And some nights, when the world is very still and the dark feels too heavy, someone lying awake will hear it again so close, it might as well be inside their own chest, dragging itself up through their lungs. Clawing at the back of their teeth, they will clamp their mouth shut and hold their breath and try not to make a sound. Because deep down, beneath all the rational denials and comforting lies, there is one truth they cannot escape. One day, the story will need a new voice. And when that day comes, the scream will not be something they hear in the distance. It will be something they make.